The leather gloves were an Orthodox scandal. Peter III's corpse lay in state, face black with bruises, neck wrapped in an absurdly high cravat. Everyone in the procession knew what the gloves hid: defensive wounds of a man who died fighting for his life, strangled by his wife's lovers. Eyewitness testimony from the public viewing and Catherine's own letters reveal what the official medical report could never explain. But Peter's murder was only the beginning. Every man in Catherine the Great's inner circle met a fate so brutal that standard biographies skim past it. One lover orchestrated her coup, then descended into dementia so severe observers could barely describe it. Another, her true love, refused medicine for his fever and died gasping in a field, begging to be laid on the ground. A third, just 22, suffocated slowly while she watched, helpless, a membrane sealing his throat shut. And her final favorite? He strangled her own son. The textbooks give you the romance and the territorial expansion. What they don't reveal is the pattern linking every lover's destruction, and once you see it, you can't unsee what proximity to absolute power actually costs. Drop a comment. Which death disturbs you most? Because this pattern changes everything you thought you knew. To understand how this cycle started, we need to begin at the end. March 23, 1801, St. Michael's Castle in St. Petersburg. Picture it. Past midnight, the castle is supposed to be impregnable, designed with moats and drawbridges specifically because the emperor fears assassination, and yet somehow a dozen officers, drunk, swords clattering against stone corridors, are storming through the private chambers. They're looking for Paul I, Catherine's son, the man who's been emperor for less than 5 years but has managed to alienate absolutely everyone who matters. They find him hiding behind a screen, a 46-year-old man in his nightclothes, and they drag him out into the center of the room. The confrontation is chaos. Shouting, the smell of alcohol and sweat, multiple men grabbing at him, and he refuses to sign the abdication papers they're thrusting at him. That's when it turns. Someone strikes him with a sword hilt, a heavy blow to the temple, and he staggers. Then the silk scarf. Accounts vary on who actually held it, but the scarf wraps around his throat and pulls tight. He's fighting, clawing, trying to breathe, and then they're on top of him, literally trampling him, boots crushing his chest until his ribs crack and his body goes still. The son of Catherine the Great is dead, murdered in the castle he built to protect himself from exactly this fate. Now here's what makes your skin crawl. Among the assassins in that room, among the men whose boots left marks on Paul's broken body, is Prince Platon Zubov, Catherine's last official lover, a man who owes his title, his fortune, his entire existence to the dead emperor's mother. How does a mother's lover end up murdering her son? The answer requires going back 4 decades to another coup, another dead emperor, and the woman who set this entire pattern in motion. But before she was Catherine the Great, before she commanded armies and lovers, she was just a terrified teenage girl trapped in a marriage that was slowly destroying her. And that's where this story really begins. Rewind to 1745, and Sophie, she won't become Catherine for another year, is 15 years old, standing in the freezing corridors of the Russian imperial palace. And she's realizing with growing horror that her entire life has just been traded away for political alliance. She's a minor German princess, daughter of an insignificant prince, and she's been imported like furniture to marry Grand Duke Peter, heir to the Russian throne. And within weeks she understands that this marriage is a catastrophe. Peter is 17, already an alcoholic, and he treats her with a mixture of contempt and indifference that's somehow worse than outright cruelty. He plays with toy soldiers in their bedroom while she tries to sleep. He parades his mistresses in front of her at dinner. He confides to courtiers loudly, making sure she can hear, that he finds her unattractive and boring. The court watches all of this with a kind of detached fascination, because everyone knows what's happening. Sophie is being slowly erased, her personality dismissed, her intelligence wasted. And the worst part is that she's supposed to just accept it, smile through the humiliation, produce an air, and disappear into the background, like every other royal wife. But Sophie isn't like other royal wives, and during those long, cold nights in her separate chambers, because Peter refuses to share a bed with her most of the time, she's learning Russian, studying Orthodox theology, reading everything she can about Russian history and politics, essentially building herself into the ruler her husband will never become. Years later, after everything that follows, she'll write something that cuts right to the heart of it. Had it been my fate to have a husband whom I could love, I would never have changed towards him. Think about that admission. She's telling you directly that if Peter had shown her even basic affection, basic respect, none of what comes next would have happened. The coups, the lovers, the murders, all of it traces back to this. A teenage girl trapped in a palace with a man who despises her, slowly realizing that the only way to survive is to stop waiting for love and start accumulating power instead. By 1762, 17 years into this nightmare marriage, Peter is emperor, and Catherine has learned every pressure point in the Russian court. Who owes money, who wants titles, who hates Peter's pro-Prussian policies. And she's also learned something else, something that will define everything that follows. That intimacy isn't just personal, it's political, and if you choose the right man, someone charismatic and ruthless and absolutely devoted to you, you can use that devotion to move armies, and she's already found that man. He's an artillery officer with a reputation for recklessness and courage. His name is Grigory Orlov, and together they're about to do something that will stain Russian history with blood for the next 40 years. Grigory Orlov is 28 years old in 1762, and he's exactly what Catherine needs: tall, physically imposing, utterly fearless, and completely besotted with her. He's an artillery officer from a family of 5 brothers, all of them military men, all of them loyal to Catherine, and more importantly, all of them willing to commit treason for her. Their affair started 2 years earlier, scandalously open by court standards. She's pregnant with his child while still technically married to Peter. But that's almost beside the point now, because what Orlov brings isn't just passion, it's operational capability. He can move through the military barracks, gauge loyalty, identify which regiments are ready to mutiny, and by mid-1762, the groundwork is essentially complete because Peter has done their job for them. As emperor, Peter has managed the impossible feat of alienating every power center simultaneously. He's insulted the Orthodox Church by trying to secularize church lands, enraged the military by ending a war with Prussia, just as Russia was winning, and then proposing to send Russian troops to fight alongside their former enemies, and horrified the nobility by threatening their land rights and importing Prussian court protocols that everyone finds ridiculous. Catherine watches all this with careful attention because she understands that a coup requires more than just military force. It requires consensus, a shared belief that the current ruler is not just bad, but intolerable. And Peter is handing her that consensus on a silver platter. The trigger comes in late June when Peter, drunk and reckless as always, publicly humiliates Catherine at a state dinner, calling her a fool in front of foreign ambassadors. And something shifts. Orlov and his brothers decide the moment is now, tonight, before Peter sobers up and remembers to arrest them. What follows happens with breathtaking speed. Orlov rides through St. Petersburg in the pre-dawn darkness of June 28th, pulling officers from their beds, calling in every favor, every oath of loyalty, and by mid-morning Catherine is standing before the Izmailovsky regiment in a borrowed uniform, and the soldiers are kneeling, proclaiming her empress. Other regiments fall in line, the Semyonovsky, the Preobrazhensky, until there are 14,000 troops behind her, And Peter, who's been at his summer palace getting drunk, doesn't even know there's a coup happening until it's already over. By evening, he's been arrested, forced to sign abdication papers in handwriting, so shaky, you can see his terror in the pen strokes, and Catherine is empress. Bloodless, surgical, complete. Except there's one enormous problem that nobody wants to say out loud. What do you do with a deposed emperor? Peter is alive. He's spineless enough that maybe he won't cause trouble. But he's also still the legitimate heir, still recognized by foreign powers, and as long as he's breathing, he's a focal point for anyone who wants to challenge Catherine's rule. So she makes a decision that will haunt her for the rest of her life. She sends him to Ropsha, a remote country estate, and she puts the Orlov brothers in charge of his security. And everyone involved understands exactly what that means, even if nobody says it directly. And what happens next at Ropsha is going to define everything about Catherine's reign and set the pattern for every death that follows. Ropsha is about 30 miles from St. Petersburg, surrounded by marshland, isolated enough that screams wouldn't carry. And Peter arrives there on June 29th, knowing exactly what this is. They're calling it protective custody, claiming it's for his own safety while the transition of power stabilizes. But Peter isn't stupid. Terrified, yes. Weak, absolutely, but not stupid. And he knows that Alexei Orlov, the man now responsible for his security, is the most brutal of the 5 brothers, the one with a reputation for settling disputes with his fists. And Alexei is walking around the estate with barely concealed contempt, making it clear through every gesture that Peter is no longer an emperor or even a person, just a problem that needs solving. The estate itself becomes a pressure cooker. Peter is confined to a few rooms, guards outside his door at all times, and the psychological torture is probably worse than any physical abuse at this stage. Because he's waiting, constantly waiting, for the moment when the pretense drops and they stop bringing him meals, or Alexei walks in with that look that says, "Tonight is the night." Contemporary accounts suggest he's drinking heavily, begging to see Catherine, writing her letters that may or may not have been delivered. And the guards are also drinking, heavily, because they're trapped in this situation too. Nobody has given explicit orders about what to do with Peter, but everyone understands the implicit order, and they're working up the courage to carry it out. 8 days pass. Think about that time frame. 8 days of Peter waking up surprised he's still alive. 8 days of Alexei and his men getting progressively drunker and angrier. 8 days of Catherine in St. Petersburg receiving reports and not countermanding anything. Her silence functioning as authorization, and then on July 6th it happens. The details are chaotic because everyone involved is drunk and panicking. There's a confrontation. Maybe Peter tries to escape or refuses to do something. Maybe Alexei just decides enough is enough. And suddenly, there's violence. Shocking and final. Peter is grabbed, thrown down, and according to the letter that will arrive in Catherine's hands within hours, multiple men are on him at once. It's not a clean execution. It's a brawl. And by the time they pull themselves off him, Peter is dead. The official cause of death that Catherine will announce? Hemorrhoidal colic, a painful bowel condition, but the letter she actually receives tells a completely different story, and the handwriting is shaky, clearly written by someone drunk or terrified, or both, and it contains what amounts to a full confession of murder. And even more damning is what happens when they put Peter's body on public display. Because Catherine needs to prove he's actually dead to stop rumors of rescue plots. But what the public sees when they file past the coffin is going to make the official medical explanation completely impossible to believe. And once you know what those eyewitnesses reported, the bruises, the positioning of the body, the specific details they tried to hide with clothing, you'll understand exactly how Peter died and why Catherine spent the rest of her life haunted by what she set in motion at Ropsha. The official announcement comes within 24 hours of Peter's death, stamped with the imperial seal, written in the detached bureaucratic language of state documents, and it's almost insulting in its transparency as a lie. The healthy 34-year-old emperor, a man who spent his days playing soldier and drilling troops, apparently died from a severe attack of hemorrhoidal colic combined with an apoplectic stroke, medical gibberish that any physician of the era would recognize as impossible because hemorrhoidal colic is painful but not fatal, and apoplectic strokes don't leave the kind of marks that require explanation. Voltaire, Catherine's great champion and correspondent, privately expresses skepticism. European courts whisper about assassination. Even Russian nobles who support Catherine's coup know the official story is fiction. But here's what makes it chilling. The fiction is necessary because the truth is sitting in Catherine's private papers, delivered to her on the day of the murder, and it's a letter from Alexei Orlov that functions as a complete confession, even though he's clearly trying to frame it as an accident. The handwriting tilts and wavers, suggesting the writer is either drunk or his hands are shaking, and the language lurches between formal justification and panicked explanation. Orlov writes that Peter was taken with a fit of colic, and that they tried to help him, but somehow things escalated. There was a struggle. He's vague on the specifics, deliberately vague. And then comes the line that exposes everything. Before we could separate them, he was dead. We ourselves know not what we did. Read that again. We ourselves know not what we did. That's not the language of an accidental death during a medical emergency. That's the language of men who got drunk and violent and beat a man to death and are now trying to process what they've done. And the use of plural we confirms it wasn't one person. It was multiple guards, a group attack, exactly the kind of drunken mob violence that leaves a body in a condition that needs explaining. Catherine receives this letter and faces an impossible choice. She can't punish Orlov because he's the father of her child and the architect of her power. She can't admit what happened because it delegitimizes her entire claim to the throne. But she also can't just bury Peter quietly because rumors are already spreading that he's alive and being held prisoner somewhere, that loyalists are planning a rescue, and the only way to definitively kill those rumors is to put the body on public display at the Alexander Nevsky Monastery. Let thousands of mourners file past the open coffin and confirm that, yes, Peter is actually dead. It's a calculated political move, and it might have worked, except for one problem. The body itself contradicts every word of the official medical report, and what those eyewitnesses saw, the specific details of bruising, the unusual clothing choices meant to hide injuries, the orthodox violations that everyone immediately noticed, is about to make it forensically impossible to maintain the hemorrhoidal colic story. The Alexander Nevsky Monastery is one of the holiest sites in Russia, and in mid-July 1762 it becomes the stage for what might be the most spectacular failed cover-up in European history. The coffin is positioned in the main cathedral, open, surrounded by candles and Orthodox icons, and thousands of mourners, nobility, clergy, common citizens, file past in a slow procession that lasts for days, and what they see doesn't match the official story at all. Peter's face is visible above the coffin edge, and it's wrong immediately, discolored in a way that no hemorrhoidal colic could explain. Multiple eyewitness accounts, recorded in letters and diaries, describe his face as dark, bruised, almost black in places, the kind of discoloration that comes from blunt force trauma or strangulation cutting off blood flow to the head. His skin has that mottled appearance of burst capillaries, and even with whatever cosmetic preparation they've attempted, you can see the damage. Then there's the cravat, and this is where the cover-up becomes almost comically obvious. Orthodox burial tradition requires the deceased to be dressed simply, reverently, but Peter's neck is wrapped in an unusually wide cravat, pulled so high it practically reaches his jawline, much higher than any normal neckwear, and everyone filing past can see what that's hiding. The cravat is positioned exactly where you'd expect ligature marks, where a scarf or cord would have pressed into the flesh and left distinctive bruising and abrasions. The positioning isn't subtle, It's screaming, "We're hiding strangulation marks," to anyone paying attention. But the detail that violates Orthodox tradition so blatantly that it becomes a scandal in itself is the gloves. In Orthodox burial rites, the deceased's hands should be bare, positioned to hold a cross or icon, a symbol of meeting God with nothing concealed. Peter's hands are covered in thick leather riding gloves, the heavy kind you'd use for outdoor work, completely inappropriate for a lying in state, and the reason is forensically obvious: defensive wounds. When someone is being strangled or beaten, they fight back instinctively. Their hands come up to protect their face, or pull at whatever's around their neck, and fingernails break, knuckles split open, palms get cut, the kind of injuries that tell the story of a man fighting desperately for his life. The gloves are there to hide that story, but by hiding it, they're actually confirming it, because no one puts riding gloves on a corpse for a state funeral unless there's something on those hands you absolutely cannot let the public see. The mourners understand this. The whispers start immediately, passing down the line of people waiting to view the body, and within days, all of St. Petersburg knows that whatever killed Peter, it wasn't a medical condition. Catherine's gambit to prove he's dead has backfired spectacularly, because now everyone knows not just that he's dead, but how he died. And the question becomes, what happens to the men who did it, particularly Grigory Orlov, the lover who orchestrated her coup and whose brother's hands are stained with her husband's blood? Catherine can't punish Orlov, politically impossible, personally devastating. So she does the opposite and rewards him spectacularly. He receives titles, estates, an enormous financial settlement, and for the next decade he's effectively the second most powerful person in the Russian Empire, her constant companion, the man foreign ambassadors know they need to court if they want access to the Empress. His brothers are elevated too, given military commands and aristocratic positions, the entire Orlov clan suddenly among the most influential families in Russia. And on the surface it looks like a love story with a happy ending. The daring officer and the brilliant empress ruling together, unstoppable. Except it isn't, because the qualities that make someone effective at staging a coup turn out to be completely different from the qualities needed to run an empire. And Catherine is realizing this with increasing clarity as the 1760s progress. Orlov is a man of action, physical courage, direct solutions. When there's a problem, you face it head-on. You use force or charm or intimidation, you solve it immediately. Catherine's mind works differently. She's reading Voltaire and Diderot, corresponding with French philosophers, developing legal reforms based on Enlightenment principles, spending hours debating abstract concepts of governance and rights, and when she tries to include Orlov in these discussions, he's visibly bored. You can see it in contemporary accounts from court observers. Orlov fidgeting during intellectual salons, leaving early from philosophical debates, his eyes glazing over when Catherine excitedly explains some new concept from Montesquieu. He's not stupid, but his intelligence is tactical and immediate, not theoretical and long-term, and the gap between them is widening every year. Catherine is evolving into one of the great intellectual monarchs of European history, and Orlov is still the artillery officer who charged into battle, and there's something almost tragic about watching him become obsolete in real time. He tries to stay relevant through grand gestures, military campaigns, diplomatic missions, building projects, but Catherine is moving beyond grand gestures into the complex work of actually reforming a massive empire, and she needs partners who can match her intellectually, people who understand legal philosophy and economic theory and administrative infrastructure. By the early 1770s, she's found those people, and they're not Orlov. New favorites are appearing at court, younger men, more educated, more refined, and Orlov can see what's happening, but can't stop it. Because the problem isn't that he's doing anything wrong, it's that he's fundamentally unsuited to the role Catherine now needs filled. The final break comes in 1772, and it's handled with political grace, no public humiliation, generous financial settlements, warm letters about their shared history. but everyone understands what it means. Orlov is being dismissed, exiled to his estates with his wealth and titles intact, but his power completely severed. What happens next is going to be horrifying, not because of violence, but because of what time and isolation do to a man who built his entire identity around being powerful and indispensable. And the mental collapse that follows is so complete, so devastating, that when Catherine finally hears about it years later, her grief will be genuine and overwhelming. Orlov retreats to his estates with enough wealth to fund a small kingdom, but money can't fix what's breaking inside him. He tries to rebuild. There's a brief marriage in 1775 to his cousin, Yekaterina Zinovieva, a young woman who, by all accounts, genuinely cares for him, and for a moment it seems like maybe he can construct a new life away from court, find meaning in something other than power and Catherine's attention. Then his wife contracts consumption, what we'd call tuberculosis, and Orlov has to watch her waste away over months, coughing blood, her lungs slowly filling with fluid, and when she dies in 1782, something fundamental breaks in him. The mental collapse that follows is devastating and progressive. Contemporary accounts from visitors to his estate describe a man who's becoming unrecognizable. Memory loss, confusion, violent mood swings, the kind of cognitive deterioration that suggests dementia or possibly the late stages of syphilis, which was rampant in 18th century aristocratic circles and produces exactly this type of neurological breakdown. He starts forgetting where he is, who people are. Sometimes he thinks he's still at Catherine's court planning military campaigns. Other times, he doesn't recognize his own servants. There are reports of him wandering his estate at night, calling out for Catherine, convinced she's sent for him and he needs to return to St. Petersburg immediately, and his staff has to gently redirect him back to his rooms like you would with a confused child. The man who once commanded 14,000 troops, who overthrew an emperor, who was possibly the most physically imposing and charismatic figure in Russian politics, is now shuffling through darkened hallways in his nightclothes, lost in his own home. The decline accelerates through the 1780s. He becomes increasingly paranoid, violent without warning, unable to maintain coherent conversation, and eventually he requires constant supervision because he's a danger to himself. When he dies in 1783, the exact cause unclear but almost certainly related to his mental deterioration. He's described as being in a state of despair and insanity. And that phrasing, that official diagnosis, tells you how complete the collapse was. News reaches Catherine, and her reaction reveals something deeper than nostalgia or political calculation. She writes, "My only answer is strangled tears. I suffer intolerably. Not, I'm saddened, or I regret his passing. She suffers intolerably, the language of genuine anguish, and the phrase, strangled tears, is particularly striking given how Peter died, like even her grief is being choked. Because she is not just mourning Orlov the person, she's mourning what he represents, the violent foundation of her power, the coup, the murder at Rapsha, all the brutal choices that put her on the throne and now haunt her as she watches the people involved destroyed by proximity to that violence. Orlov went mad, but he wasn't the only casualty, and the man who replaced him in Catherine's affections and her bed is about to demonstrate that the price of proximity takes many forms, starting with the eye he lost in a vicious attack that may or may not have been Orlov's final act of jealous rage. Grigory Potemkin enters Catherine's orbit in 1762 during the coup itself. He's a junior officer in the Horse Guards, one of thousands who declare for Catherine that day. But he doesn't become significant until years later, when Catherine, increasingly bored with Orlov's intellectual limitations, starts noticing this tall, brilliant, strange-looking man who can actually keep up with her in conversation. Potemkin is everything Orlov isn't: educated, cultured, fluent in multiple languages, capable of discussing theology and military strategy and architectural theory with equal facility, and Catherine is starving for exactly this kind of intellectual partnership. Their affair begins in 1774, after Orlov's dismissal, and it's different from anything that came before. This isn't just physical attraction or political alliance. This is genuine intellectual and emotional connection, possibly the only time in Catherine's life she finds someone who matches her on every level. Contemporary letters between them are intimate, playful, deeply affectionate in a way her correspondence with Orlov never was. But there's something you notice immediately in every portrait, every description of Potemkin. He has only one eye, and the left side of his face carries the scarring of serious trauma. And how he lost that eye is one of those historical mysteries where the official stories don't match, and the truth is probably more violent than anyone wanted to admit. There are three competing explanations, each more suspicious than the last. The first, most sanitized version, claims it was a tennis accident. He was playing royal tennis. Somehow a ball or racket struck his eye with sufficient force to destroy it, a tragic sporting injury. The second version blames medical malpractice. He had some kind of eye infection or inflammation. A court physician treated it incompetently, perhaps used caustic substances or performed a botched procedure, and the eye was permanently damaged. Both of these stories have the advantage of being blameless, random misfortune, nobody's fault. But the third version, supported by several contemporary sources and whispered about in court circles, tells a much darker story. Grigory Orlov, in a fit of jealous rage over Potemkin's growing closeness to Catherine, attacked him with billiard cues, not a single blow, but a sustained beating that left Potemkin badly disfigured. And in that version, the eye wasn't accidentally injured, it was deliberately destroyed. Think about the logistics of that. Billiard cues are heavy, wooden, designed to strike with force. And if Orlov caught Potemkin alone, maybe in a billiard room at court, and flew into the kind of violent rage he was known for, one strike to the eye socket with enough force would shatter the orbital bone, rupture the eye itself, cause exactly the kind of catastrophic damage that no amount of 18th century medicine could repair. The scarring that portraits show on the left side of Potemkin's face is consistent with major trauma, not a tennis accident or botched medical treatment, and the fact that he acquires the cruel nickname Cyclops suggests the injury was shocking enough to define his appearance permanently. Catherine never comments publicly on how Potemkin lost his eye, which is itself suspicious. If it were truly an accident, why the silence? The most likely explanation is that she knows exactly what happened, knows Orlov did it, and can't acknowledge it without admitting that her former lover maimed her future lover in a jealous assault which would be politically catastrophic. So Potemkin becomes her partner, her co-ruler, in everything but name, disfigured but brilliant. And for 17 years they'll build an empire together until his body betrays him in the most agonizing way imaginable. For 17 years, Potemkin is essentially Catherine's co-ruler. He annexes Crimea, builds entire cities, commands armies, oversees the colonization of the southern territories, and maintains a relationship with Catherine that evolves from romantic to something more complex, more durable, possibly a secret marriage, though historians still debate that. They're partners in the truest sense, finishing each other's strategic thoughts, dividing the empire's administration between them, and even after their physical relationship cools, they remain devoted to each other with an intensity that transcends simple political alliance. But in autumn 1791, while Potemkin is in Jassy, modern-day Romania, negotiating the Treaty of Jassy to end the Russo-Turkish War, something goes catastrophically wrong with his body. It starts with fever, the kind that comes on suddenly and savagely, spiking so high that he's drenched in sweat within hours, shaking with chills even though it's autumn and not particularly cold. His staff recognizes immediately that this is serious, likely malaria, which was endemic in the marshy regions around Jassy, or possibly typhoid fever from contaminated water, both of them killers in the 18th century when medical intervention was primitive at best. The physicians attending the military campaign urge him to rest, to take quinine for the fever, to let them attempt treatment with whatever remedies they have available, but Potemkin refuses. This isn't just stubbornness, though he's certainly stubborn. It's a deep, almost paranoid distrust of doctors that's been building throughout his life, possibly intensified by watching botched medical treatments at court, possibly related to whatever actually happened to his eye. He waves away the physicians, literally pushes their hands away when they try to examine him, refuses to take quinine even though it's the only effective treatment for malaria, and his fever is climbing to dangerous levels. You can imagine the scene. Potemkin, this massive, powerful man who's conquered territories and commanded hundreds of thousands of troops, now lying on a campaign bed, skin burning, clearly dying, and still asserting control by refusing the one intervention that might save him. His body, which has always been his instrument of power, his physical presence, his energy, his ability to work 20-hour days overseeing military operations and administrative details, is being systematically destroyed from within by microscopic parasites or bacteria, and there's nothing his willpower can do about it. The fever rages for days, and reports sent back to Catherine in St. Petersburg describe him becoming delirious, thrashing, barely coherent. And then something shifts in him. Maybe a moment of clarity, maybe just animal instinct. And he decides he can't die here, not in Jassy, not in a military tent. He needs to move, needs to get somewhere else. And despite his staff's protests, he orders them to prepare a carriage because he's leaving. And what happens during that carriage ride is going to be one of the most haunting death scenes in Russian history. They load Potemkin into a carriage on October 5th, 1791, and it's immediately clear this is a terrible idea. He can barely sit upright. The fever has reduced him to a trembling wreck. His breathing is labored and shallow. But he's insisting on movement, maybe thinking he can reach better doctors, maybe just unable to accept dying in a military encampment like some junior officer, and the carriage lurches forward onto the rough Moldovan roads heading toward Nikolaev. They make it maybe 5 miles, possibly less, before everything goes wrong. Potemkin suddenly can't breathe. Not the labored breathing of fever, but acute suffocation. Like his airway is closing, his lungs aren't processing oxygen, and he's gasping, clawing at his throat, the kind of desperate struggle for air that's terrifying to witness. His attendants are panicking because they're in the middle of nowhere, no doctors, no medical supplies, just empty countryside, and Potemkin manages to gasp out an order, "Stop the carriage! Stop now!" The driver pulls to the side of the road, and they're surrounded by fields, autumn grass gone brown, mist hanging low because it's early October and the temperature drops at night. And Potemkin looks out at this landscape and makes his final command. Not a military order, not instructions about the empire or messages for Catherine. Just 5 words: "I want to die in the field." Think about what that means. This man who built cities, who annexed Crimea, who commanded the Black Sea Fleet, whose final title was Prince of Taurida, is asking to be laid on the ground like a wounded animal seeking instinctive comfort from the earth. His retinue, officers, servants, people who followed him through military campaigns, carefully lift him from the carriage, and someone produces a Turkish carpet, probably from Potemkin's own baggage, since he traveled with luxury goods even on campaign, and they spread it on the damp ground and lay him down. The scene is almost biblical in its starkness. The powerful man brought low, literally returned to the earth, surrounded by people who can do absolutely nothing to help him. The mist is thickening as evening approaches, the temperature dropping, and Potemkin is lying on that carpet in the middle of a Moldovan field, still burning with fever, still struggling to breathe, and then the struggling stops. October 5th, 1791, the Prince of Taurida dies on a carpet in a field, and when news reaches Catherine, she's devastated in a way that surprises even her. Closest advisors, because everyone assumed their romantic relationship was long over, but what they shared went deeper than romance. It was partnership. It was the kind of bond that only forms between two people who've built something massive together, and his death leaves a void in her life that will never be filled. But not all of Catherine's lovers died from violence or fever. Some deaths were more intimate, more devastating precisely because they came from genuine affection rather than political calculation. And the story of Alexander Lanskoy is going to show you what happens when Catherine allows herself to truly love someone young and vulnerable, because what kills him is going to be more horrifying than anything that happened to Orlov or Potemkin. Alexander Lanskoy appears in Catherine's life in 1780, and he's different from what came before in every meaningful way. He's 22 years old, Catherine is 51, and he's not a military hero or an intellectual powerhouse or a political operator. He's just a junior officer from the Horse Guards, good-looking in a gentle, almost delicate way, cultured, well-read, and when Catherine meets him, something shifts in her that hasn't existed since maybe the early days with Potemkin. This isn't about power or empire building or filling the void left by Potemkin's transformation from lover to political partner. This is something closer to genuine romantic love, the kind that makes her feel young again, protective, almost maternal in her devotion. Her letters from this period reveal a Catherine most people never see. She writes about Lanskoy with tenderness that borders on obsession. She's teaching him, guiding his reading, commissioning art for him, essentially molding him into her ideal companion. And there's real joy in it, not the calculated pleasure of political maneuvering, but actual happiness. Court observers note the change in her demeanor. She's lighter, more playful, she laughs more easily, and Lanskoy seems genuinely devoted to her in return, not just performing devotion for advancement, but actually caring about this woman who's giving him access to worlds he'd never have reached otherwise. They read together, ride horses, attend the theater, and Catherine decorates his apartments with extraordinary luxury, commissioning paintings and sculptures, filling rooms with books, creating a space that reflects her vision of refined civilization. But there's an undercurrent of anxiety that runs through all of this, visible in her letters to friends and confidants. She worries constantly about Lanskoy's health, mentions every cough or fever or complaint with the kind of detail that suggests genuine fear, not just casual concern. He's young and seemingly healthy. There's no obvious reason for this worry, but Catherine has lived long enough and lost enough people that she's developed an almost superstitious dread about anyone she allows herself to love, and in 1784, 4 years into their relationship, those fears are going to be realized in the most brutal way imaginable, because Lanskoy is about to contract diphtheria. Now, if you don't know what diphtheria does to a human body, if you only know it as a disease that killed people in the past before vaccines, you're not prepared for what's coming, because the way diphtheria kills isn't quick or merciful, or even particularly painful in the traditional sense. It's suffocation, slow and conscious, and Catherine is going to have to watch every minute of it, completely helpless, despite all her imperial power, as the disease systematically closes Lanskoy's throat and takes him away from her breath by struggling breath. Diphtheria hits Lanskoy in June 1784, and at first it seems like a bad cold. Sore throat, slight fever, nothing alarming. But within 48 hours it becomes clear this is something else entirely. In the 18th century they called it throat distemper, or, more grimly during epidemic years, the year of strangulations. And once you understand the pathology, you'll realize that second name is horrifyingly accurate, because diphtheria doesn't kill through fever or organ failure. It kills through suffocation, methodical and inevitable. Here's what happens inside Lanskoy's throat. The Corynebacterium diphtheriae bacteria colonize the mucous membranes of his tonsils and larynx, and as they multiply, they release a toxin that kills the surrounding tissue, and the body's response to all this dead tissue is to form a pseudomembrane, a thick, leathery, gray-white coating that's literally made of dead cells, fibrin, bacteria, and white blood cells. This membrane grows, spreading across the tonsils, down the throat, covering the larynx, and it adheres so tightly to the living tissue beneath that any attempt to remove it causes massive bleeding. The membrane gets thicker every day, progressively narrowing Lanskoy's airway. And you can hear the disease advancing because his breathing changes. First, it's just difficulty swallowing, then a harsh quality to his voice. Then actual audible stridor, a high-pitched whistling sound that means the airway is critically narrowed, and every breath requires immense effort. Catherine watches this progression with growing horror because she understands what's happening even if the physicians can't explain it clearly. Lanskoy is being strangled from the inside, slowly, consciously, and there's nothing anyone can do. The only potential intervention is a tracheotomy, cutting directly into the trachea below the obstruction to create an emergency airway. But this is 1784. There's no anesthetic, no sterile technique, no antibiotics if infection sets in, and the procedure itself is so dangerous and traumatic that physicians won't attempt it unless death is literally imminent. So Catherine sits beside Lanskoy's bed while he struggles to breathe, each inhalation more labored than the last, his face taking on the bluish tinge of oxygen deprivation. And he's conscious through all of this, aware that he's suffocating, probably terrified, and the empress of all the Russias, the woman who commands millions, who overthrew emperors and annexed territories, can do absolutely nothing except hold his hand and watch. The membrane continues growing, the airway continues narrowing, and eventually, probably after days of this torture, Lanskoy simply can't pull enough oxygen through the remaining opening, and he dies, asphyxiated, while Catherine watches. Her grief afterward is described as overwhelming, genuine devastation that incapacitates her for weeks. And you can understand why, because this wasn't political, this was personal. This was losing someone she genuinely loved to a death that was both medically inevitable and psychologically unbearable to witness. But even this tragedy doesn't end the pattern, doesn't break the cycle that started with Peter III's murder in 1762, because there's one more favorite to come, one final lover who will complete the circle by participating in the murder of Catherine's own son. And understanding how we get from Lanskoy's death to Paul VI's assassination requires going back to that castle, that scarf, and recognizing that the violence Catherine used to gain power has now turned inward to devour her own bloodline. Which brings us back to where we started, to the castle, to the scarf, to March 1801, but to understand how we get there, we need to meet Catherine's final favorite, the man who represents everything that went wrong with the system she created. Platon Zubov enters Catherine's life in 1789 when she's 60 and he's 22, the same age gap as Lanskoy. But where Lanskoy was gentle and cultured, Zubov is vain, greedy, and nakedly ambitious in ways that even court observers find distasteful. He's handsome in a calculated way, knows exactly how to flatter Catherine, and she elevates him with shocking speed, showering him with titles and estates and military commands he hasn't earned. And unlike her previous favorites, who at least contributed something, Orlov's military capability, Potemkin's genius, Lanskoy's companionship, Zubov just takes. He accumulates wealth compulsively, demands higher positions, interferes in state policy despite having no real competence, and becomes widely despised by the nobility who see him as a corrupt parasite draining imperial resources. When Catherine dies in 1796, her son Paul I becomes emperor, and his first major act is to exile Zubov immediately, stripping away his positions and sending him away from court. and there's genuine satisfaction among the nobility because everyone knows Zubov represents the worst excesses of Catherine's later years. But exile doesn't neutralize Zubov, it radicalizes him. He spends the next 5 years networking with other disaffected nobles, military officers who despise Paul's erratic policies, aristocrats whose privileges have been curtailed, and he becomes one of the central conspirators in a plot to overthrow Paul, maybe force him to abdicate in favor of his son Alexander, definitely remove him from power by whatever means necessary. Paul knows conspiracies are forming. It's why he built St. Michael's Castle with its moats and drawbridges. Why he's paranoid about security. But he can't identify all the conspirators, and he certainly doesn't realize how far they're willing to go. March 23, 1801. Zubov is among the dozen officers who storm into Paul's chambers, drunk and armed, and when the emperor refuses to abdicate, when the confrontation turns violent, Zubov is there when the silk scarf wraps around Paul's neck, there when they trample him, there when Catherine's son, the child who survived her coup in 1762 and grew up knowing his father was murdered by his mother's lovers, is himself murdered by his mother's final lover. The symmetry is almost unbearable. 39 years earlier, in 1762, Catherine's lover Grigory Orlov orchestrated a coup that ended with Peter III strangled at Ropsha, and now, in 1801, Catherine's lover Platon Zubov participates in a coup that ends with Paul the Frisch strangled at St. Michael's Castle, and the method is even the same: a scarf around the throat, suffocation, the violence intimate and brutal. The cycle that began with using intimacy as a tool for power has completed itself by destroying Catherine's own bloodline, and the question we're left with isn't just about Russian history or Catherine's reign. It's about what happens when the mechanisms you use to seize power, violence, conspiracy, intimate betrayal, become embedded in the structure of how power operates. Because those mechanisms don't disappear, they perpetuate, they metastasize, they eventually consume everything. And the final section is going to force us to confront the real cost of proximity to absolute power. Look at the pattern in full. Grigory Orlov, the man who made Catherine empress by overthrowing her husband, orchestrated a murder at Ropsha, and then descended into such complete dementia that contemporary observers struggled to document the extent of his mental disintegration, dying in a state officially recorded as despair and insanity, while Catherine wrote of strangled tears and intolerable suffering. Grigory Potemkin, her intellectual equal and possibly the great love of her life, may have lost his eye to Orlov's jealous violence, then refused medical treatment during his final fever and died gasping for air in a misty field, laid on a carpet like a wounded animal seeking comfort from the earth. Alexander Lanskoy, the gentle 22-year-old she genuinely loved, suffocated slowly over days as a leathery membrane grew across his throat, while Catherine watched helpless, all her imperial power meaningless. Against diphtheria's methodical strangulation, and Platon Zubov, the corrupt final favorite who represented everything wrong with her system, participated in strangling her own son with a silk scarf in the very castle Paul built to protect himself from exactly this fate. Every single man in her intimate circle either died violently, went mad, was ravaged by disease, or became a murderer himself. There are no exceptions. No one who escaped. No fairy tale ending where proximity to power brought anything except destruction. This wasn't random misfortune or bad luck spread across decades. This was a deliberate pattern embedded in how Catherine secured and maintained power, a structure built on intimacy as a political tool where lovers weren't just companions but instruments of influence, military capability, administrative control, and that instrumentalization corrupted everything it touched. The violence that put Catherine on the throne, the coup, the murder at Ropsha, The lies about hemorrhoidal colic didn't end in 1762. It metastasized through every relationship that followed, turning love into leverage and partnership into conspiracy, until the same methods that gained her the crown were being used to murder her own bloodline. And here's what makes it truly horrifying. Catherine wasn't uniquely evil or exceptionally cruel by the standards of 18th century monarchs. She was actually more enlightened, more intellectual, more reform-minded than most of her contemporaries. But she understood something fundamental about absolute power that we still struggle to acknowledge, that to seize it requires violence, and that violence never stays contained. It spreads like infection through every relationship, every institution, every mechanism of control, until the people closest to power are the ones most thoroughly destroyed by it. The methods you use to gain power become the methods that define how power operates, and those methods will eventually consume everything you value, everyone you love, even your own children. Because power doesn't recognize boundaries between political and personal. It recognizes only proximity and utility. Catherine lived long enough to watch nearly everyone in her intimate circle destroyed, Orlov mad, Potemkin dead in a field, Lanskoy suffocated. But she didn't live to see the final consequence, Paul's murder in 1801. And maybe that's a mercy, because witnessing that would have forced her to confront the complete truth, that the coup she staged, the violence she authorized, the system of intimate power she perfected, had come full circle to strangle her own son using the exact same methods she'd used against his father. This was the price of proximity. Not metaphorical cost or abstract consequence, but literal destruction, murdered, maddened, diseased, or turned into killers. And the question we're left with isn't whether Catherine was a great ruler or a monster, it's whether any system built on violence and intimate betrayal can ever produce anything except more violence and betrayal, generation after generation, until everyone touched by power is consumed.